I'm Cathryn Ploehn.
And I'm Kelsey Campbell. We represent Data Science, an organization devoted to highlighting the LGBTQ+ experience using data science and visualization. We'd like to share our experiences today working on our ongoing project, Visualizing Trans Lives Violently Taken Too Soon, a project made in service of the yearly event Transgender Day of Remembrance.
We begin by situating ourselves and our work with a discussion of how we encounter death in the world as people. In her essay, Love as the Practice of Freedom, scholar Bell Hooks emphasizes how the processing of grief is essential for life-giving political change. In the wake of loss, a path to healing, justice, and action is well known by community organizers and activists, with a rich history of visual representations. Data visualizations are part of that rich visual history, wielded by folks such as W.E.B. Du Bois and Florence Nightingale, who used data visualization politically, making particular kinds of living and loss known, evident, and acted upon. That's because data visualization is powerful as a visual sense-making tool. They help us make sense of realities distributed over time and space, nearly impossible otherwise. How data visualizations present the world to us, by design and aesthetics, set us up for certain kinds of relationships to those realities represented through data. And yet, practices for visualizing data about death often fall short of making sense of those losses, of being in good relationship with the loss of those who have passed. At the time of writing, in January 2021, every day we are losing similar numbers of people to COVID-19 as the 9/11 terror attacks. On September 11th, 2001, Americans like me experienced the numbers of dead and dying through visceral and heart-wrenching video, through blood, dust, and shrapnel. Using these images, we were at least able to grieve, make some kind of meaning out of the immense pain of those political losses, for better or for worse, feeling that those people were taken from us. In sharp contrast, the realities of the dead and dying during our current pandemic are decentralized across the entire country, often hidden away in lonesome hospital rooms. We must then use visual sense-making tools such as data visualization to aggregate and make sense of the loss. Those taken are often abstracted into the lines and dots in the visualizations deployed by news and academic organizations like the New York Times or Johns Hopkins University. But does it feel like 9/11-sized losses are occurring every single day? In a pandemic left out of control by our government, many of these losses are avoidable, but does it feel like people are being taken away from us? And for many, untouched by a virus disproportionately hitting across class, race, and gender identity, it's hard to get a sense for the loss based on these visual representations, let alone begin to process this ongoing trauma. And if we don't feel and process losses, personal or political, we can't do the work that needs to be done in response. Activist and scholar Johanna Macy asserts that the refusal to feel takes a heavy toll. The energy expended in pushing down despair is diverted for more creative uses, depleting the resilience and imagination needed for fresh visions and strategies. But why are we so numb in the wake of such sophisticated data visualizations of loss? It begins with the body. Philosopher Samuel Todes asserts that our own human body is the underlying metaphor through which we make sense and meaning of the world, and thus, as Stephen Neely asserts, the designer has to offer a primary interaction or secondary metaphor to foster meaning, metaphors closer to the feeling of the body, such as animations, 3D shapes, and so on, create more visceral and profound meaning for us than those that rely on many layers of abstraction, such as geometric primitives or the English language. What metaphors, then, do commonplace Dataviz tools offer? Still and crisp lines and circles are a far cry from the multitudes of the humans abstracted within, metaphorically essentializing, and in turn disappearing bodies into the tick of a vector. Humanity is scrubbed away in this paralysis, a disembodiment that is a well-known critique of Dataviz. On the whole, geometric aesthetics, titles, and annotations come together in interactive digital experiences that help us imagine the situation and move our way through the data, through the loss, in a particular way. We are left to make sense of the numbers of the dead through comparisons and through measurement. We see that two visual sense-making tools, video and data visualizations, produce two radically different relationships with the past. And in this moment of profound grief and loss, the dead and grieving deserve more than just a numbing analytical aesthetic. We would argue that a successful data visualization that helps us understand our losses would not only logically show us X number of losses is a lot, but also give us a visceral feeling for the weight of that huge number of human loss. Further, in the wake of the grief that inevitably pushes to the surface, a good Dataviz might frame a path in making meaning of the loss, and perhaps even taking action. But how do we actually do that? We recount our process in our ongoing project, Visualizing Lives Lost to Anti-Trans Violence.
Transgender and gender-diverse people around the world face unbelievable violence and oppression in the form of societal hostility, lack of legal protections, and increasing political scapegoating. Factors that especially impact Black and trans women of color, sex workers, migrants, and refugees. These daily realities are well known within the transgender community, even by those like myself who hold a lot of privilege and are not subjected to the extreme marginalization the most vulnerable in the community encounter. In the face of this extreme violence and discrimination, the transgender community shows great resilience, with activists and nonprofits working to fill in the gaps that are left by state apathy. One of these long-standing efforts is the impossible task of monitoring murders and deaths of trans individuals globally. Transgender Europe and UK software engineer Anna Jane Metcalf work with local organizations around the world to identify and document deaths of trans people. This work is extremely difficult. In addition to the gruesome nature, trans folks are often intentionally misgendered in reporting and rarely get justice. Community relationships are crucial in identifying as well as respectfully recognizing and honoring these victims. As you read these reports, you are confronted with the horrific reality of anti-trans violence. Over and over, it is sickeningly clear that the victim was targeted because of their transgender status. While painful to read, the graphic records were actually the original motivation for this project. People outside of the transgender community need to feel the weight of this violence and truly understand the urgency for trans rights. At the heart of these records is a call to bring awareness and visibility to trans lives that were taken too soon. Because Metcalf and Transgender Europe collect these reports, we are afforded an opportunity to bear witness to the magnitude of anti-trans violence and the often suppressed stories. That is the spirit in which we also humbly visualize this data. For trans audiences that are already aware of or even facing this violence, efforts to honor and memorialize known lives that were lost take place in yearly vigils held for Transgender Day of Remembrance. These events already make space for feelings of solidarity, community, grief, and validation, and serve folks in trans communities relatively well. But what of folks not within these spaces, but sympathetic? As with the Black Lives Matter movement or our current pandemic, folks outside of the lived experience must also bear witness to it and take action. Our project takes up the task of speaking to cis audiences who must viscerally feel the legitimacy and inherent value of trans identities in life in order to act meaningfully as allies.
Even further, Dataviz folks are often in a place where they must clamber into the world of someone else's data, make sense of it from a different perspective. I, as a cisgender person, must do my best to understand the realities this data must tell us of, its purpose as told by those within that world. In climbing into the world this data tells us of, we internalize its purpose, which serves as a North Star for this project. In asking why the data was collected and what practices and feelings the data enables, we found the need to memorialize, to honor, and to bear witness to trans victims and their stories.
We bring these imperatives together in an approach to handling the data for visualization, which becomes handling the story of each person's life. For a community that is so often erased, this is a tremendous responsibility. In fact, data doesn't even feel like the right term to use to describe such important records of trans lives lost. Each of these reports are painstakingly researched by the local community, the Transgender Europe team, and Metcalf to compile as much information as possible about the circumstances of death, as well as who that person was in life. We make a point to continue this manual approach to curation in our humble usage of this data. The stakes are just too high for automation, and because of that, we manually touch each piece of information that we intend to display to ensure that it is both accurate and respectful. This process is an ongoing negotiation that often involves wrestling with or paying attention to a number of complex dynamics. This process is certainly imperfect, and one that requires a tremendous amount of personal awareness and cultural competency of both the trans community and a general audience. However, from the initial report or identification to our final visualization, each of these records has been touched multiple times by members within the transgender community, with the single goal of honoring the victim through bringing awareness to their life and death.
After building an approach for handling the data, we sought ways to internalize it. Given our goals to memorialize, honor, and bear witness, what kind of attunement, ways of thinking, and feeling are preferred when engaging with this data?
My initial visualization was driven by a desire for more cisgender folks to be exposed to the data records and ultimately gain an understanding of the scale and horrifying reality of anti-trans violence. The visualization displays the records in a more accessible way.
However, we sought options for data visualizations that also bring the necessary feeling of grief and meaning into our hearts. We started with taking a look at the way TDOR began as a physical vigil. Metcalf provides a guide with principles for hosting your own day of remembrance. We synthesized these into a flow of feelings one might experience during a vigil, a guide for experiencing the reality behind the data. The moves in a vigil resonate with Joanna Macy's spiral, a pattern of moves for coping with grief, pain that transforms us into relationship and action. What specific rituals or actions, then, might ground each of these feelings? Kelsey drew from their experience attending TDOR vigils, and we brainstormed specific acts. We grouped those actions into larger categories, which serve as the foundation for building visual metaphors. And because they are grounded in physical space, we stay attuned to how the body might feel in encountering related metaphors. From that flow of both feeling and physical movement, we were set up to build data visualizations that speak to those moves, to let us grieve and to honor the lives lost. Here lies a meaningful path, a set of moves for encountering data about death, a script that evokes a sense of honor, memorialization, allows us to bear witness, which may ring true to the purpose of telling those stories.
Emerging from the world of the data, we have both a sense for the purpose and feelings that drive meaningful grief with data of loss. Every visual we concoct must flow from this purpose, and from there, we can design towards a relationship. Cis audience bearing witness to a world of trans beauty and anti-trans violence, cultivated through data visualization.
Meanwhile, every visual we create comes from our own position, culturally, geographically, identity-wise, and so on. For me, being a part of the cis demographic substantially bounds my perspective, and this project might not be appropriate without a collaboration between both me and Kelsey. Even larger, both of us are white, middle class, and were raised in so-called America. We place ourselves there, drawing from visual grief practices from our own lived experiences. Instead of usurping others, we own that situatedness. Thus, we don't offer an all-encompassing grief visualization solution. A multitude of visual grief cultures will produce multitudes of unique visualizations, and the following is ours. So, what kind of digital interactions emerge from the flows within a vigil? From this place grounded in physical categories for acting and feeling, we brainstormed visual metaphors and a journey map for an interactive experience. In our current draft of the experience, you begin in the presence of trees representing those who are lost. The labor, purpose, and meaning of the data are framed up front. We begin hearing an individual's story, while looking at a spotlighted tree representing them. Then the tree is destroyed from the scene, and all that is left is the branch representing their story. You collect the branch, placing it into a wreath. We continue non-linearly, meandering through stories. The path is random, and like in a vigil, we hear each person's story. Trees continue getting destroyed, and you continue to add branches to your wreath, until all that's left is an empty landscape. We feel the absence of the trees, the void left by their destruction. In the midst of all that loss, we turn to celebrate the beauty of the wreath you now hold, containing the wealth of stories from those gone. You are then tasked with tangible moves, links to community for trans folks already not involved, and a kit of materials for action aimed at cis folks. You take the wreath with you as a digital artifact. There are a lot of deaths. The time required of you engaging with this visualization is lengthy. The task of hanging with the data, the stories, is tiring. By the end, you might feel the weight of the death and the beauty, the gift of these stories. You might also have a forward motion towards allyship. Let's break apart some noteworthy visual aspects of this journey map. For us, the journey to find a visual metaphor began at wreaths. Beyond being a common feature at American funerals, from Mexican-American families in the 20th century to traditional Appalachian funerals, wreath-making is also an ancient practice in many cultures. Wreaths can represent what was shed of the past, both metaphorically and literally. In America, during the Victorian era, hair was considered a gift for intimate friends, and was incorporated into funeral wreaths. In making a wreath, the act of braiding is a show of attention, of beauty. Kimmerer in Braiding Sweetgrass speaks of the connection of kindness and something more that flows between the braider and the braided, the two connected by the cord of the plait. In making a mourning wreath, we are attending to the stories with care. Even further, wreaths are a tangible memento mori, a visual reminder of our relationship to those stories woven into the wreath as we take up the task of responding to the violence behind the losses. What could convey the presence of those past? Trees shed branches and leaves, like hair, or stories, to be woven into the wreaths. In the absence of living people to define how they are visually presented in death, trees provide a welcome visual metaphorical presence. Across the globe and history, cypress trees are closely entangled with human beings, both materially and spiritually. As a visual metaphor, trees provide a sense of presence and preciousness to those they represent. Cypress trees refer to a Victorian visual mourning culture in America. Even deeper, trees visually convey not only the category-defying nature of the trans identity, but the multitudes of the human spirit. Ecological metaphor is exceedingly eager to represent heterogeneity and diversity. We complement the presence of trees with images of those they represent. Images of people are perhaps the best visual to represent humanity, and are often provided in the dataset, but sometimes aren't around and won't alone convey that feeling of presence like a 3D virtual object, like a tree might. Trees also afford us to convey losses in a very physical way. Often we see visualizations showing loss as an increase visually, lines moving upwards, bar charts getting bigger, but really it feels like the opposite. When we lose someone, we see the empty space they once occupied. The empty rooms, shoes unworn. It's like a gaping hole of who was once there. 3D and VR are possible ways to get closer to that feeling of walking into that empty room. In our project, we begin in the presence of a forest, each person represented as a tree. One by one, we hear their story, and the trees are destroyed until all that's left is an empty landscape, an empty void. Even further, using ecological metaphor and placing those trees in a spiral are strategies for reorienting our attention away from a mode of analysis and counting towards that feeling of presence and absence. In our work, we forged just one path for data visualizations that might hold open space for feeling and making meaning from loss. Here, we attuned to the frame of a vigil, for internalizing the purpose for bearing witness to precious lives lived and lost, manifesting them in a Dataviz that made visible and visceral feelings of presence and absence through stories woven into a symbol of meaning and action. But this isn't an end-all, be-all solution, just an opening, a conversation about how we might mindfully begin to design for data visualizations that help us make sense of loss behind a numb analysis.
As of this talk, this project is still ongoing. We welcome discussions about what it means to visualize the lives of those who have been lost. We also invite you to sign up for updates about the project and to check out the written version of this talk, which has more links and resources. Thank you for listening.